Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show dedicated to discussing translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Like usual, we're going to jump right into a discussion of an item description, but this time, keep an eye out for repeated text during the comparison. Holy Chalice of Central Pthumeru, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. However, with this not being an all-encompassing holy chalice, it is not a thing which can change the form of a chalice dungeon by means of a ritual. Furthermore, Pthumeru is the name of an ancient race that built the underground ruins. They are said to have been an inhuman people who possessed knowledge holy and mysterious. Also, speaking of repeated text, the Lower Pthumeru Chalice and the Central Pthumeru Chalice have the exact same description. More importantly, as you may have noticed, the final lines on both of these chalices are identical to the final sets of lines on the Pthumeru Root Chalice and the Central Pthumeru Root Chalice that we looked at last time. So why pay such close attention to these bits of repeated text? Well, it lets you identify something of a template for these items. From the chalices we've looked at recently, we can see that first the effect of the type of chalice is identified, then a bit of extra information is given relevant to the location the chalice is linked to. This template has the effect of emphasizing continuity between these different chalices. Since both the Pthumeru Root Chalice and the Central Pthumeru Root Chalice begin with the same three lines about breaking multiple labyrinth seals and changing the form of the labyrinth, the link between them as root chalices is emphasized. Likewise, because the Central Pthumeru Chalice and the Lower Pthumeru Chalice begin with the same three lines about breaking a single labyrinth seal and not changing form, we can see the connection between regular chalices. Yet all four of these items are linked together by the final set of lines about the Pthumerians, the wise creators of the underground ruins. This is a unifying bit of information related to Pthumeru. But having identified this pattern to the text of these chalices also serves to highlight the exception to this sort of formulation. It's been a long time since we talked about the very first Pthumeru Chalice back in episode 14 of Translationborne, but you'll note that the text for this item follows none of the conventions established in later chalices. This makes sense because, after all, why shouldn't the first chalice we receive tell us how to use chalices? But I think it also makes this item description stand out a bit in hindsight, and now that we've seen this pattern established, other exceptions to it that we find going forward will stand out as well. Now that we've established that particular pattern though, I'd like to briefly return to a point I believe I've made in my Chalice Chat series about the naming of these items. That is, it's very clear that each progressive chalice that we get takes us further down than the previous one. To use the official English phrasing, we start with the Pthumeru Chalice, then get the Central Pthumeru Chalice, and proceed to the Lower Pthumeru Chalice. This seems to have a good amount of thematic significance, and as such, I wanted to point out that I think the decision to refer to Lower Pthumeru in the official English as opposed to a more literal, Deep Pthumeru is a good one, because it illustrates our downward progression clearly by making use of a recognizable sequence. It's a case where I think the additional context of our plunging ever deeper down into the chalice dungeons alters how we might look at the translation of this item name. In isolation, the change from deep to lower might seem odd, while here I find it quite natural. Having said that though, I think it's time we turned our attention to another chalice item, keeping that template we picked up on in mind. Holy Chalice of the Ancillary Tombs, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. Ancillary tombs mean remote areas of the underground ruins. These are areas of tombs and death of little ritual significance. It is said that even now, the defenders continue their expansion of the ancillary tombs. So, even though this is a new item covering a different area of the chalice dungeons, I think something of that template is still discernible here. The opening line is the same as in the Central Pthumeru and Deep Pthumeru chalices. Then there's a short explanation of the term hintertomb, which, as I've discussed before, is a unique game term that could stand to get its own definition. And then finally there's a bit of information on the hintertomb region itself, that bit about areas of tombs and death, as well as ongoing expansion. We'll have to keep an eye on how subsequent chalices either do or don't fit into what seems to be something of a common formula here. But in terms of issues more directly tied to specific words, what I'd like to focus on is the term used to describe the beings responsible for the continued expansion of these hintertombs. The Japanese being used for them is moribito, which you'll note I have more literally translated as defenders, while the official term used is watchers. Now, moribito isn't actually a word that shows up in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary, but it is a compound word using a kanji commonly translated as protect or defend, followed by the kanji for person. So why go with the relatively obscure term of watcher for the official translation? Well, I can think of at least two reasons. First, note that while the kanji used in the first part of this term is commonly given the English meaning of protect or defend, its meaning actually goes beyond those two concepts alone. For instance, the verb mamoru, which uses the same kanji, has additional definitions that include to carry out a prescribed task or follow rules, and to watch something constantly. Recall as well that what these watchers are described as doing is not a simple act of defense, but a continued expansion of the Hintertombs. By implying that these beings are watching over the underground ruins, you can convey the literal sense of watching something, the figurative sense of defending something, and even get at the idea of performing upkeep. But there's still another reason why the term guardian or defender is perhaps best avoided here. And this gets back to a point I briefly brought up when I looked at the translation of the Bone Ash set towards the end of Translationborne episode 28. That item description also speaks of guardians, though the term used in Japanese, bannin, is different. This does happen to be a word that appears in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary, and it's defined as a person who keeps watch. So, in other words, there are at least two distinct types of defenders present in the Chalice dungeons. The Japanese terms used to identify them are unique, but their literal translations are quite similar. This is yet another reason why the official translations for these words would end up being watcher and keeper, simply to provide some variety. Both terms can be used to mean a kind of defender, but they're also distinct from one another as well as highly evocative. But we've still got some more chalice items to look at. Let's see what happens to the description as we look at one that would take us deeper into the Hintertombs, keeping that template in mind. Holy Chalice of the Deep Ancillary Tombs, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. However, with this not being an all-encompassing holy chalice, it is not a thing which can change the form of a chalice dungeon by means of a ritual. The ancillary tombs are areas of tombs and death of little ritual significance. They are also a nest for dangerous poisonous snakes and venomous insects. So here we have what seems to be a mismatch. The Japanese text, which I've provided a literal translation for, follows the template we've seen so far for holy chalices after the initial chalice of a given region. It has the same opening line about breaking a single seal in the underground ruins. It has the same middle section about not being a root chalice and so being fixed in form. And then it concludes with a couple lines that seem to sum up the Hintertomb region. The official English text, on the other hand, is identical to the text used on the regular Hintertomb Chalice. Now, I'm not sure why exactly this is the case. We've already seen evidence of updated text in the past, examples of text with what appear to be updated translations that weren't used, and in general we've gotten a number of indications that there was some time pressure involved in the translation. So it could be due to a number of reasons. But this does highlight one of the potential issues of working with a lot of reused and recycled text. Because while there can be some interesting and positive aspects of this sort of thing when used in a game, repeated text tends to get skipped past more easily. This is as true of looking over a piece of text as it is of a player who is taking this in more casually. Once you recognize, oh, this is identical to what I've seen before, it's easy to dismiss something. Fortunately, because of the nature of all this repeated text, it's also easy to piece together what the official translation for this item would be if it followed the same pattern as the Japanese, because we've seen most of the individual pieces of the template already, and the one set of lines that we don't have existing phrasing for, we're about to look at. So, jumping ahead just a little bit, let me read out what the official translation for this item probably ought to be, with my own more literal version depicted in text. Lower Hintertomb Chalice, a chalice that breaks a labyrinth seal, but only a root chalice changes the shape of the old labyrinth when used in a ritual. The Hintertombs are unceremonious homes to graves and death, cesspools of noxious snakes and insects. And suddenly things are lining up much better. In terms of form, this updated version ties in very nicely with the Lower Pthumeru Chalice, which opens with the same set of lines, while the final section of each item description differs based on location. One gets a kind of generic summary of information on the Pthumerians that carved out the underground ruins, and the other provides a bit of info on what to expect in the Hintertombs. In terms of content, though, not much is really lost, despite this item's description not entirely matching up with the Japanese. Of course, if the issue had been more extensive, it would be more serious, but taken all together, I think this provides an interesting look at how repeated text can impact things in a game and in translation. Speaking of content, though, there's one more item I'd like to take a look at here, and it features a set of phrasing that by now you will probably be quite familiar with. This time, though, I'd like to shift my focus away from the overall patterns we've been looking at so far and towards the actual wording being used. Because there's one aspect of the Hintertombs I'm not sure is getting across, and it's come up a lot. All-encompassing Holy Chalice of the Ancillary Tombs. One of the all-encompassing Holy Chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. Holy Chalice dungeons, with their seals broken by an all-encompassing Holy Chalice ritual, are known for changing their form every time a ritual is performed. The ancillary tombs are areas of tombs and death of literal ritual significance. They are also a nest for dangerous poisonous snakes and venomous insects. And again, I'll quickly point out that the Lower Hintertomb Root Chalice has the same text. Now, what is it about the text concerning the Hintertombs I find it difficult to process? Well, it's the repeated references to the tombs being unceremonious, to use the phrasing of the official translation. You may have noticed that in my more literal version I've employed the phrase, of literal ritual significance, and that this is a piece of information about the Hintertombs that has been presented in every item description concerning the region so far. This is coming from a phrase in the original Japanese, Saishi shoku no usui, and it's not exactly the most common formulation. That said, the latter parts of this phrase are pretty straightforward. The particle no is being used to modify the term saishishoku with usui, which means thin or weak. That is, this is an area with low saishishoku, and that's the term that's the real puzzle. It of course does not show up in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary, although what appears to be the base word, saishi, does. This is a term for a ritual or ceremony meant to honor either the gods or one's ancestors. Adding the kanji for iro, most likely read here as shoku, is probably meant to modify the term so that it refers to the quality of the base term. This would give us a literal understanding of the phrase to mean something like thin in ceremoniousness. From there, I think it's pretty easy to see how one could make the leap either towards the phrase of little ritual significance or unceremonious. But remember, there's that aspect of saishi that refers to ceremonies to either the gods or one's ancestors, and I'm not sure that's fully coming through in either of these interpretations. Here I think it might be useful to look at a few other terms that are defined in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary that are related to the word saishi. First, there's saishi iseki, and if that latter term, iseki, sounds familiar, it's because the game frequently refers to underground ruins, or chika iseki, when referencing the Chalice dungeons. Anyway, these are defined as ruins of locations where spirits were worshipped. Then there's the term saishi sozoku, which is defined as the system of inheritance whereby the position of being able to preside over a ceremony to one's ancestors is passed on. So again, we're seeing a strong connection to the worship of both gods and one's own ancestors. This actually ties in pretty well with another item where we learn about rituals conducted in the underground ruins, the Shaman Bone Blade, and wouldn't you know it, the Japanese used in the item name here contains another use of the term saishi. This time it's saishi sha, which is ritualist or shaman. And to be fair, I do think that the use of the word shaman in Shaman Bone Blade does go some way to conveying the sense of ancestor and or spirit worship implied by the Japanese term. But I think it's a bit harder to read that into the word unceremonious when used to describe the Hintertombs. So what does all this boil down to? Well, I think something of the sense of the mingling of inherited power and spiritual power is lost. Considering how blood echoes are literally meant to be the dying will of blood, how the Great Ones are obsessed with conceiving children, and given the presence of vile bloods, I think getting at the idea of ancestor worship is relevant to the themes of the game. That said, this may simply be one of those areas where it's just harder to get across that concept in English as opposed to in Japanese. For one thing, even my more literal version that uses the phrase of little ritual significance doesn't get this across any better than the official unceremonious. And remember, one of the other problems with repeated text is making it fit within a variety of character and line limitations across several items. Of course, it's always possible that I'm reading too much into this potential intersection between inheritance, lineage, and spiritual power, but I wanted to raise the possibility where it seemed relevant. Anyway, that's going to bring this episode to a close. I hope you found this extended look at some fairly formulaic text interesting, and as usual, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them, especially with the new section markers on display while I'm comparing item descriptions. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.